Everyone thought my family was perfect. A cozy home, a happy marriage, and an adopted son who completed the dream. But the truth behind that door was a tragedy. Love in excess turned into indulgence, and indulgence into greed. Jonathan, the son I once cradled in my arms, had devised horrifying schemes, forged papers, a secret pit in the garden, even a slick floor covered in oil, all just to seize this house. And then, my husband and I, two old souls, were forced to do what we had never imagined: stand against our own son. This is not only a story of betrayal, but also of choice, forgiveness, or justice. Asterisk. If you're watching this video, please like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. I'd be so happy to connect with you. My name is Catherine Morgan, 68 years old. I once thought my life was simple: a small house, a man who knew how to love, and that would be enough. William, my husband, was a carpenter who spent his whole life with wood, with the scent of resin and the familiar rasping of the plane. We met in a small church in the town of Maine and married after only a year of courtship. People often say marriage is a gamble, but if that's true, then I was lucky to have won that bet. For William, though sparing with words, was the strongest shoulder I ever leaned on. In the early years of our marriage, we lived in a spacious house that William had renovated with his own hands. Wide windows, long hallways, a living room always scented with fresh wood. And yet, as each winter passed, the house grew strangely empty. We still loved each other, still cooked together, still took evening walks along the lake. But in the vast yard, there were no small footsteps, no bubbling laughter of a child. I used to believe that if we tried hard enough, a little angel would come to us. William and I tried everything: visits to big hospitals, expensive prescriptions, even nights when we prayed together in silence beneath the church roof. I still remember the moment the doctor shook his head. "It's very difficult, Catherine." Those words slammed shut like an iron door. I sat silently on the chair, while William held my hand, his calloused palm trembling, unable to find words of comfort. That night, I turned to the wall, quietly swallowing my tears, while he lay beside me, pretending to sleep. Though his shoulder quivered, there were Christmas seasons when we set the table for chairs, but only two of us sat down. I prepared a place for a child who never appeared, poured a cup of hot milk, only to clear it away when the feast was over. Outsiders thought we were happy because husband and wife were united, but only William and I knew, in that brightly lit home, emptiness was what filled the most space. One day, Florence, our kind neighbor, dropped by with a basket of apple pies. She said bluntly, "Catherine, why not think about adopting a child? There are so many little ones out there who need a home." I forced a smile, but her words were like a stone cast into a still pond. That night, I couldn't sleep, my mind filled with the image of a child running in the garden, calling me mother. At first, William hesitated. He feared our love might not be enough to fill the void of all those years. But then, one windy evening on the porch, he gently placed his rough hand over mine and said, "If you want it, let's try." I too longed to hear a child's voice in this house. And so, the journey began. After many months of paperwork, waiting, and hoping, the fateful day finally came. I remember it clearly, a spring morning when the orphanage door opened, and a little boy with tousled brown hair and wide, curious eyes walked toward us. The caretaker placed his small hand into mine. "This is Jonathan." At that moment, I suddenly burst into tears. The tears I had held back for so many years were finally released. William stood beside me, his eyes red but his smile gentle. Jonathan looked at us with a bewildered gaze, but when I lifted him into my arms, a giggle escaped his lips, washing away all the loneliness that had haunted our large home. That night, as I cradled Jonathan and lulled him to sleep with a quiet tune, I realized I had become a mother, not by blood, but by love. And that love, I believed then, would be enough to fill a lifetime of emptiness. I still remember Jonathan's very first night sleeping in our home. I laid him in the little bed William had built with his own hands, the sheets still carrying the scent of new fabric. But only minutes later, Jonathan began to cry. I panicked, never having known how to soothe a child. I pulled him close, gently patting his small back. Then, by some instinct, I softly sang the lullaby my own mother once sang to me as a child. "Hush, little baby, don't you cry." My trembling voice gradually steadied, and, miraculously, just moments later, Jonathan stopped crying. His tiny eyelids fluttered shut, his soft breath resting against my shoulder. He clasped my finger, like a fragile thread binding us tightly together. In that instant, my heart overflowed. At last, I was a mother. No birth certificate, no bloodline, just that quiet breath beside me. And that was enough. The next morning, I rose early to prepare breakfast, slicing bread, pouring warm milk, my heart joyful as if I had just been given a priceless gift. William watched silently. He rarely spoke much, but I could read his eyes filled with both happiness and hesitation. I knew he worried. Perhaps he feared I would place too many hopes on a child who had only just entered our lives. But I was different. Every giggle, every clumsy step of Jonathan's made me forget all fears. Whatever he wanted, I gave. A shiny toy car, brand new sneakers, even ice cream on a cold, rainy day. William would sometimes frown. "Catherine, our son cannot always have everything he wants." I laughed it off, placing my hand on his shoulder. "We've waited for this boy too long. If he wants something, I just want to give it to him." He stayed silent, not arguing. That was William. He chose to swallow his words rather than make me sad. Yet sometimes his eyes grew distant, as if he saw something I could not. A future where too much love might turn into a burden. Once, Jonathan broke the heirloom vase my mother had left me. I heard the sharp crash, shards scattering across the floor. William rushed in, his face filled with anger. "Son, you must apologize to your mother." "That was a precious keepsake," Jonathan whimpered and hid behind me. My heart ached. I quickly held him close, soothing him. "It's all right. It's just a vase. You're fine. I'm not angry." William looked at me, about to speak, then swallowed his words. And so, I became Jonathan's shield. I thought I was protecting him, giving him the unconditional love I had always longed to give. But deep down, I didn't realize I was covering up small mistakes, which, little by little, turned into habits. Florence, our neighbor, would sometimes say with concern, "Catherine, the boy is being spoiled." I laughed it off, taking it as a tease. I thought, how could loving a child too much ever be wrong? Now, looking back, I wish I had listened more, been less soft-hearted. But a mother, once she has cradled her child, sometimes no longer sees the boundaries. I only knew how to love blindly. William stayed by my side, patient and quiet. Night after night, he lay beside me, staring silently at the ceiling before sighing. I knew he wanted to speak but was afraid of hurting me. And so, every warning vanished into silence. Many years later, when tragedy finally struck, I came to realize love without discipline is like a fire spreading wild. Warm at first, but without control, it will burn everything down. I sit here now, after so many storms, telling you this story with only one hope, that someone else might avoid the mistake I once made. I sigh, whispering softly as if confessing to myself, we never knew that too much love could also be a mistake. Jonathan grew up as swiftly as a passing breeze. Not long ago he had clung tightly to my hand, and now he was already running across the yard, his voice chirping, "Mom, Mom, look at me." Each time he called out in joy, my heart blossomed. There was nothing I wouldn't give him: a toy, a set of clothes, or even the smallest things, a new box of crayons, a shiny bicycle. Whatever Jonathan wanted, I always nodded yes. And Jonathan knew it well. He never heard the word no. Other children in the neighborhood often had to beg their parents many times before being allowed to play. But Jonathan only needed to look at me with those wide, pleading eyes and say, "Mom, I want this." And I would soften instantly, not thinking of the consequences. William sometimes tried to set boundaries. As a carpenter, he had lived his life in discipline and order. One afternoon, Jonathan begged for yet another gaming console, though he already had two in his room. William set down his newspaper, his voice stern. "Son, toys aren't things you can have just because you want them. You must learn to value what you already have." Jonathan immediately pouted, lips trembling. My heart ached, and I rushed to intervene. "William, it's just a console. If he wants it, let's buy it. What harm is there?" He shook his head, eyes filled with helplessness. But in the end, he fell silent, letting me take Jonathan to the store. I thought, childhood only comes once. Why be stingy with a little money? And so, indulgence slowly became routine. Jonathan learned that with a little whining, his mother would take his side. Whenever William frowned, Jonathan would hide behind me, as if I were an unbreakable shield. And in my blind love, I even felt proud that my son trusted me, came to me for protection. I still remember one summer evening. In the living room, I had displayed a blue glazed ceramic vase, my mother's wedding gift, the only thing left of hers after she passed away. Jonathan, about 10 at the time, was running around full of energy. With just one misstep, the precious vase toppled from the shelf, crashed to the floor, and shattered into fragments. William rushed over, his face darkening. "Jonathan, do you know how valuable that vase was?" Jonathan's eyes widened, and he backed toward me, lips trembling. I didn't mean to." My heart clenched at the sight of tears brimming in his eyes. I quickly spread my arms, pulling him close, shielding him from William's stern gaze. "It's all right. It's just a vase. Objects can be replaced, but a son cannot." William fell silent, his hand tightening before dropping limp at his side. I saw both anger and disappointment in his eyes, but he said nothing more. He only bent down to gather the shards, his hand sliced by a thin edge, blood seeping out. Jonathan nestled deeper into my arms, soothed by my caresses. While I believed I had done the right thing, protecting my son from pain. But later, when I thought back to that moment, I realized I hadn't just shielded my son from fear, I had also shielded him from the lesson he needed. I had denied him the chance to see the consequences of his actions, and in doing so, I had unknowingly planted in Jonathan the belief that his mistakes would always be forgiven, as long as I was there to cover for him. William rarely argued, but from that day on, an invisible distance began to grow between us. He chose silence, perhaps to spare me pain. Yet that very silence made me sink even deeper into the illusion that I was doing the right thing. I didn't know then that every time I defended Jonathan, I was taking away a piece of the strength he needed to learn how to stand on his own. Rumors in the neighborhood spread faster than the wind. I still remember an autumn afternoon when I took Jonathan to the nearby grocery store. He was 10, holding a brand new toy car, whistling with pride sparkling in his eyes. As we stepped through the door, I heard two women whisper to each other, making no effort to hide their voices. "That boy is spoiled beyond measure. It won't be long before he turns out bad." My heart tightened, but I kept a smile on my face. Pretending not to hear, I bent down to tie Jonathan's shoelaces, the smell of street dust mingling with the fresh plastic scent of the toy in his hand. He looked at me, grinning brightly, completely unaware of the whispers. I felt like a shield, protecting him so he could live in a world filled only with joy. Back home, William sat in his old wooden chair, reading the newspaper. He looked up when Jonathan and I walked in. I told him I had just bought another toy for our son. He said nothing, only folded the paper and sighed. At first, that silence unsettled me, but then I comforted myself. He doesn't understand. An orphan child, who once had no one to protect him, deserves to be given twice as much. There were nights when I lay awake, restless. I knew Jonathan was growing up in arms filled with too much indulgence. But whenever I thought of those early days when he wandered lost in the orphanage, those bewildered eyes staring back at me, I could not bear the thought of him suffering any more sadness. And so, I kept giving in, kept making myself the mother who never said no. Once, Jonathan brought home a failing grade. Instead of scolding him, I pulled him close and whispered, "It's all right, as long as you're happy." Jonathan smiled, a smile bright as morning sunlight through the window. I knew I was wrong. A child needed discipline, needed to learn how to face failure. But in that moment, when I saw his smile, all reasoning slipped away. Jonathan's smile became an intoxicating drug, one I would trade every principle for. Just to see it again. Florence, my dear friend, often warned me, "Catherine, loving your child is right, but loving this way is no different from binding him in your arms." I shook my head, smiling faintly. "Florence, you don't understand. Jonathan is everything to me." I thought I was right. I thought boundless love would nurture him into a man who could give love back. But I was wrong. Years later, when the storms came crashing down, I finally understood. Love without discipline is like planting a seed and never training its growth. At first, it sprouts green and innocent, stretching upward freely. But with time, it spreads wildly, winding and choking, draining the life from everything around it. I sit here now, recounting those years with a lump in my throat. For our love, which seemed so sweet, had in truth planted the seed of tragedy. I sigh, gaze into the distance, and confess to myself and to you, the one listening to this story. We planted a seed, never knowing it would grow into a vine that would strangle us. Jonathan left school with a diploma in hand, but his future was as foggy as a misty October morning. His peers rushed to find work, some in factories, others in companies, while Jonathan lingered at home, glued to the TV screen or laughing loudly into his phone. I tried to persuade him. "You should try applying to an office somewhere, or at least take a temporary job at the supermarket." Jonathan only smirked. "Mom, I wasn't born to do such trivial things. I deserve more than that." Those words filled me with both pain and worry, but then I nodded, telling myself that every young person has their dreams. William, however, was not as lenient. He observed in silence, the lines of worry deepening around his eyes in the months that followed. Jonathan spent money as if it grew from thin air. The newest phone, expensive watches, cars rented by the month. Each time I shook my head, he would wrap his arms around me, whining like he had as a child. "Mom, I just want to enjoy life a little. I've already suffered so much not having real parents. Don't I deserve to live better now?" My heart melted, my refusal stuck in my throat. Once again, I opened my purse. Once again, I agreed. And so the indulgence continued, not toys or crayons anymore, but enormous sums of money. William spoke up many times. One evening, after Jonathan had gone out with friends, he set down his coffee cup and looked me straight in the eye. "Catherine, do you see how he's living? He's never once stood on his own 2 feet. If you keep giving him everything, one day, he'll see us as his burden." I froze. His words cut through the fragile hope I clung to. But as always, I brushed them aside. "You're overthinking it. He just needs more time to find his path. He'll be fine." William didn't argue. He only sighed, resting his head in his hand, his shadow stretching long across the wall, wearier than ever. As for me, I still clung to my fragile happiness. Each time Jonathan smiled, dressed in new clothes, his eyes sparkling with confidence, I saw in him the same little boy who once nestled in my arms, believing his mother would always be there. I dared not think deeper, dared not look directly at the abyss opening before us. William's warning haunted me for days. I tried to shake it off, But every time I saw Jonathan squander money, a vague unease stirred inside me. I wanted to believe he would change, that as he matured, he would come to understand his parents' struggles. But I hesitated, unable to face the possibility that William might be right. To admit that would be to confess my failure as a mother. Jonathan grew bolder. He wasted no thought before spending on luxuries, sports cars rented by the week, lavish meals at expensive restaurants. Once, when I reminded him to save money, Jonathan smirked. "Mom, this house will be mine anyway. Why should I worry?" I was struck silent, unable to reply before William's voice cut in, sharp and stern. "Jonathan, this is your parents' house. Don't forget that." The air grew heavy. Jonathan narrowed his eyes, leaned back on the sofa, his tone dripping with challenge. "If it's mine, why don't you let me put my name on it? I'm your only heir. Or are you planning to give it to someone else?" I panicked, raising my hands between father and son. "Stop it. Don't fight." "Jonathan, what are you saying? This is the home of our whole family." But Jonathan didn't stop. He sprang to his feet, pointing at William. "I have the right. If you truly love me, then put this house under my name right now." William's fists clenched, but he held himself back, his eyes burning with a fury I had never seen before. He said nothing more, only turned away, leaving me with a hollow feeling that chilled me to the bone. I collapsed into the chair, my heart pounding. Jonathan still stood there, breathing hard, his eyes blazing with ambition. In that moment, I no longer recognized the boy I had once cradled in my arms, the boy I had lulled to sleep with gentle songs. Before me stood a young man, full of demands and anger, ready to sacrifice family ties for a sheet of paper granting ownership. I tried to smile, tried to cling to the illusion that this was only a moment of recklessness. But deep down, I knew a line had been crossed. From love to indulgence to greed, everything was now laid bare. I lift my head, looking straight at you, the one listening to my story, and sigh. From that day on, I knew the tragedy had begun. One April morning, Jonathan suddenly appeared in the kitchen, holding a neat stack of papers in his hands. He wore a wide smile, his manner cheerful as if bringing good news. "Mom, Dad, I've looked into something. There's a new program called Premium Home Maintenance. If you sign this contract, everything related to repairs will be taken care of. You won't have to worry about anything anymore." I was caught off guard. Jonathan had never once shown interest in fixing the roof or dealing with leaky pipes. William tilted his head, his gaze sharp with suspicion. But Jonathan spoke quickly, as if to sweep away all doubt. "I've arranged everything. All you have to do is sign here." He placed a pen on the table, his smile unusually warm. I picked up the stack of papers, skimming a few lines. The long strings of legal jargon made my eyes blur. Maintenance contract, transfer of rights. I didn't fully understand, but because it was from my son, I felt nothing to fear. William frowned slightly, pulling the papers closer, flipping through them slowly. He hadn't yet asked a question before Jonathan cut in. "Don't worry, Dad. I've checked everything. This is just a guarantee. Our home will be better taken care of." A warmth suddenly filled my heart. For years, Jonathan had been criticized as reckless, irresponsible. Now, seeing him take interest in the house moved me to tears. I thought, maybe, at last, he's grown up. That very day, I arranged to meet Victoria Adams, the community lawyer I knew through the women's volunteer group. I brought the papers along, planning to ask her to review them just to be safe. Victoria was a sharp, quick woman, her eyes always bright and incisive. When I laid the file on her desk, she opened it, scanning line by line. Within minutes, her face darkened. "Catherine, this isn't a maintenance contract. This is a deed of sale." Her voice dropped, each word striking my ears like a hammer blow. I laughed nervously, trying to shake off the chill creeping down my spine. "That can't be. Victoria, my son gave me this. He would never. Victoria cut me off, tapping her finger on the bold print. Look here. Party A agrees to transfer full ownership of the property. This is clearly a house sale. If you and William sign this, the house will no longer belong to you. I sat frozen. A roaring filled my head, as if the room itself were collapsing. I wanted to believe Victoria, yet I also wanted to believe my son. Shaking my head, my voice trembled. Maybe this is just some clerical mistake. Jonathan probably didn't understand the documents, so. Victoria placed her hand on mine, her gaze steady. Catherine, I don't want to hurt you, but I've seen many cases like this before. If you don't believe me, take the papers to a notary yourself and ask. I pulled my hand back, clutching the stack of documents to my chest, trying to hide my trembling. Inside me, two forces tore at each other. On one side, a vague fear. On the other, a stubborn faith in the son I had raised since infancy. That night, when William asked me about the papers, I only murmured, maybe Victoria misunderstood. Jonathan could never deceive us. He's our son. William said nothing more. He only looked at me for a long time, his eyes heavy with both worry and sorrow. I turned away, holding the papers tight against me, as if clinging to the fragile thread of faith I still had left. I wasn't ready to accept that the flesh and blood in our home might be laying a trap for his own parents. After speaking with Victoria, my heart was in turmoil. I wanted to believe her words, but part of me stubbornly insisted it must be a mistake. Jonathan was my son, how could he betray us? But William was different. He didn't speak much. He simply prepared quietly. One evening, I found him in his study, carefully opening the safe. He pulled out the house deed, the insurance papers, and the savings book. Instead of putting them back, he wrapped them up neatly and hid them in a secret compartment beneath the wooden floor. I asked, my voice shaking, "What are you doing, William?" Without looking at me, he answered curtly, "Just in case." I was speechless, unsure whether to protest or agree. Perhaps he had already accepted the truth I was still trying to deny. A few days later, the cruel truth came to me in a way I could never have imagined. I was tidying the kitchen when the doorbell rang. Before I could answer, I noticed the feed from the door camera, the one William had installed long ago, showing Jonathan standing on the porch beside a well-dressed man in a suit. I froze, wiping my hands on my apron, eyes glued to the small screen. Jonathan's familiar smile appeared, but in his eyes a glint flickered that sent a chill down my spine. His voice was low, yet the microphone caught it clearly. "This house will be mine soon. Just line up the buyers. It's only a matter of time." I went numb. My trembling fingers dug into the edge of the table, sweat breaking out though the air was cool. The man beside him nodded, jotting notes, while Jonathan, he smiled. A triumphant, radiant smile, but to me, it was ice, freezing me to the core. William entered. Seeing me frozen before the screen, he said nothing, only placed his hand firmly on my shoulder. I wanted to cry, to scream that it was all a misunderstanding, but the evidence before me had torn apart the fragile faith I clung to. That night, I sat in my room, listening to the wind whistle through the cracks in the door, my heart unbearably heavy. Jonathan's image on the screen replayed in my mind. The calculating voice, the unfamiliar smile. It felt as though I had just lost a piece of my own heart. The piece I had once believed was the most beautiful. I whispered softly, as if confessing to myself and to you, the one listening to my story. That smile of his that day, colder than winter itself. After the documents were exposed, Jonathan went quiet for a while. I thought he had repented, that what Victoria had warned us about was only a temporary misstep. But in truth, that silence was only the prelude to another scheme. One weekend morning, Jonathan appeared in the living room with a handful of glossy brochures. He smiled, his voice dripping with sweetness. "Mom, Dad, I've found a premium care service for seniors. There you'll have private doctors, comfortable rooms, gardens, and even recreation areas. I think it's time you both rested and enjoyed life." I was taken aback. William, who had been reading the paper, quietly folded it, his eyes stern. Jonathan stepped closer, placing the pamphlets on the table. They showed smiling elderly couples strolling through wide courtyards. Bright rooms like those in hotels. At first glance, nothing looked amiss. "I just want you both to have a more comfortable place to live," Jonathan continued earnestly. "Our house is old, repairs cost too much. Over there, you'll be cared for much better." I glanced at William, saw his furrowed brow, though he said nothing. As for me, my heart wavered again. After all that had happened, I still longed to believe that my son only wanted the best for us. The next day, Jonathan drove us there for a visit. On the way, he talked endlessly about a peaceful future, about restful days in old age. Sitting in the back seat, I listened, my heart sinking. Part of me wanted to believe him, but another part, the part that had been warned again and again, kept sounding alarms inside me. When the car stopped, I was stunned. Before us stood a gleaming building, tall glass doors, and a wide lobby scented faintly of lavender. The staff, neatly dressed in uniforms, greeted us with constant smiles. They led us through well-furnished rooms, each with large windows looking out onto gardens. There was a library, a warm water pool, a physical therapy area. It looked no different from a resort. I turned to William, who stayed silent, only observing. Jonathan walked beside us, brimming with excitement. "See, Mom? You and Dad will be so much healthier living here." I forced a faint smile, but unease gnawed at me. Everything was too perfect, so perfect it felt artificial. The way Jonathan hurried us from place to place, the way his eyes followed the staff as they handed us folders of information. It all sent chills down my spine. On the way home, Jonathan couldn't stop pressing. "I think you should decide soon. Opportunities like this don't stay open forever." I nodded absently, just to appease him. But inside me a dark foreboding stirred. Everything was too fast, too smooth, like a play rehearsed in advance. And no matter how impressive the facilities, I couldn't shake the feeling that Jonathan's true aim had nothing to do with our health or happiness. That night, the house lay in silence. Only the steady ticking of the grandfather clock echoed in the living room. Restless, unable to sleep, I stepped into the hallway to fetch a glass of water. As I passed Jonathan's room, faint voices drifted through the half-closed door. Instinct urged me to stop. My heart pounded, each beat like a hammer against my chest. I held my breath and listened. Jonathan's voice came through low, but unmistakably clear. "Don't worry. Once they sign, the house will be mine." "Yes, just a few more days." I froze. My hand trembled so violently I nearly dropped the glass. In that instant, the fragile trust I had clung to for so long was torn apart. All the sweetness, all the words of concern, it was nothing but a mask for a darker plot. I staggered back, pressing my palm against the cold wall, struggling not to break down into sobs. When Jonathan's door slammed shut, I hurried back to our bedroom. William was still awake, a book in his hands but his eyes distant, as though waiting. I sat beside him, clutching his rough hands, my voice hoarse. "William, you were right. He's not sending us to a home so we'll be healthier. He wants this house." He didn't look surprised. He only nodded, as if he had known all along. Yet in his eyes I saw a sorrow so deep, the sorrow of a father realizing the son he had devoted his life to had now turned his back in betrayal. We sat together in silence for a long time. At last, William squeezed my hand firmly, his voice resolute. "Catherine, we cannot let him deceive us again." I nodded, tears streaming down my cheeks. From the day Jonathan entered our lives, I had sworn to protect him at all costs. But now I understood. Protecting him no longer meant shielding his mistakes. If I continued, Our lives would be destroyed in the hands of the very son we had raised. That night, we made a plan. William would check every document, hiding the important ones away. I would quietly seek out Victoria for legal help, and Florence, my dearest friend, would be brought in as a witness. This time, we decided we would not wait. We would not close our eyes and let it pass. I sat close beside William, listening to the wind whistle against the window, listening to the weight in his breathing. I leaned my head on his shoulder, trembling yet steadfast. For the first time, I felt that we two aging souls were about to step into the fiercest battle of our lives. And strangely, I no longer wanted to run. I looked at William. His eyes no longer carried sorrow, but burned with determination. In that moment, I knew we were united. I turned to you now, whispering as if to share a secret. That night, I looked at William, and we both knew it was time to fight back. After that fateful night, William and I understood. If we stayed still, we would soon lose everything. But confronting Jonathan head-on now would be like throwing ourselves into the wolf's jaws. So we chose another path, to pretend to go along with his plan. The next morning, when Jonathan eagerly brought in yet another set of documents, I smiled and nodded. You might be right. We're old now, maybe it's time to think about resting. Jonathan looked surprised for a moment. Then his eyes gleamed with triumph. He wrapped his arm around my shoulder, his voice dripping with honey. I knew you'd understand. Mom, just leave it to me, everything will be fine. William sat nearby, only curling his lips into a faint, bitter smile. He said nothing, but I knew his heart burned with rage. Still, we kept the act alive. The more Jonathan believed we had softened, the more careless he became. That very afternoon, I quietly went to see Florence. My dear friend opened the door, her gentle eyes filled with curiosity. After hearing everything, her face darkened, her hands tightening around her teacup. Catherine, I've suspected for a long time, but I never imagined Jonathan would scheme this far. Don't worry, I'll be a witness. If needed, I'll tell the police everything I've seen. I clasped Florence's hand, torn between sorrow and gratitude. In those darkest days, her friendship was the anchor that kept me from sinking into despair. I didn't stop there. I sought out Victoria as well. With her sharp gaze, she listened intently, then nodded firmly. I knew he wouldn't give up so easily. She spread the documents across the table, pointing out each step. First, we must ensure the deed never falls into his hands. Second, the moment he makes another move, you must tell me. We'll build a case piece by piece. Victoria taught me how to recognize disguised contracts, carefully explaining every small clause I had once overlooked. She said, your trust was the greatest weapon he used. Now, turn vigilance into your strength. I took notes diligently, my hand trembling but my eyes no longer the same. For the first time, I didn't feel like the mother who only shielded her child. I was learning how to protect myself and our family from the very son I once believed was the greatest gift of my life. When I returned home, William was waiting on the porch, the wooden chair creaking under his weight. I shared what Victoria had taught me. He nodded, his voice low and steady. Good. If he wants to play this game, then we'll play it to the end. But this time, we hold the advantage. I looked at him and felt the strength of our unity in every breath we shared. Two aging souls, hair already silvered, now forced into the most dangerous game of our lives against our own son. Cruel as it was, I knew there was no turning back. I still remember the feeling in those first days of putting our plan into motion. My hands constantly trembling, my heart pounding as if it would burst out of my chest. I was a woman used to the kitchen, to the window overlooking the rose garden, someone who had never known schemes or deceit. Yet now, I had to learn how to lay traps, how to deceive the very son I had raised for 38 years. Some nights, I sat alone at the kitchen table, the yellow light spilling down as I stared at the mock contract Victoria had prepared for us to test Jonathan. My hand shook so badly that my writing turned crooked. But within that fear, another fire rose. Determination. I could not let William and myself fall victim again. I could not allow this house, the place where we had poured our sweat, where every nail and shelf was built by William's hands, to be taken by greed. Jonathan seemed fooled by our performance. He looked at us with eyes half pity, half disdain, as if his elderly parents had finally come to their senses and obeyed their son. Each time he pushed papers before us, I nodded gently, pretending interest, asking soft questions like a fragile, trusting mother. William played his role perfectly too, sometimes even adding, "Perhaps you're right. We should think about old age." Every time I heard him say that, my chest tightened. But that very act fed Jonathan's arrogance. He grew careless, making phone calls right in the living room, leaving documents in drawers, even boasting to a friend once, "Just a few more steps, and this house will be mine." I heard it from the kitchen, my fists clenching so tightly that blood beaded from my palms. But I didn't step out. I didn't expose him. I knew the more he believed victory was near, the greater our chance to unmask him. Through those days, I felt as though I was walking a tightrope. On one side, a pit of despair. On the other, a fragile hope. One misstep, and all would collapse. But whenever I looked at William, his calm eyes, his steady hands, I found courage again. We were no longer just an old married couple. We were comrades, stepping together into the fiercest battle of our lives. I lifted my head, staring into the emptiness before me, as if looking straight into the face of the younger Jonathan I once knew. My voice trembled, yet carried a resolve I had never felt before. We raised him to grow up. Now it's time to teach him how to become a man. After the nursing home scheme failed, Jonathan grew restless, his eyes darting about as if plotting something new. I had learned to trust a mother's instinct. Whenever my son was unusually quiet, it meant a storm was brewing. One morning, as I carried the trash out to the yard, I noticed the patch of soil near the fence had been disturbed. The earth was fresh, damp, as though it had been dug up during the night. I knelt down, brushed aside the layer of dry leaves covering it, and my heart clenched. It wasn't a flower bed at all, but a shallow pit just deep enough to make someone stumble and fall. A shiver ran through me. In an instant, all the pieces clicked into place. Jonathan wanted us to fall, perhaps to build the story that his frail parents could no longer take care of themselves. Then he would have a perfect, legal excuse to place us in a nursing home, and the house would be his. I sank onto the steps, my hands trembling. The pain of realizing my own son, the boy I had raised all these years, had set a trap for us, was almost unbearable. But before the tears could fall, William stepped outside. He quietly studied the pit, then turned to me, his voice low. Let him fall into his own trap. Catherine. That afternoon, we pretended to take a stroll in the garden, just as we often did. I held William's hand as we walked slowly toward the freshly dug ground. Jonathan sat inside, eyes fixed on us through the window, his stare tense and hungry, like a predator waiting for its prey. We walked along the edge of the pit, then paused, feigning casual conversation. William leaned slightly forward, as though about to step down. I held my breath, my heart pounding so loudly I thought the whole yard could hear it. And then, just as we expected, Jonathan couldn't restrain himself. He burst out of the house, shouting in mock alarm, "Mom, Dad, be careful. Let me check that spot for you." In that instant, William and I stepped back. Jonathan rushed forward, his shoes pressing down on the soft edge of the soil. With a sudden crack, the ground gave way, and he tumbled straight into the very pit he had dug. I gasped, the sight both grimly comical and chilling. Jonathan scrambled to his feet, his face smeared with mud, his white shirt stained brown. He roared in fury. Who tampered with my pit?" I turned my face away to hide the bitter smile tugging at my lips. While William stood silent, his eyes steady, as though he had been waiting for this moment all along, Jonathan staggered in the shallow pit, mud clinging to him in thick, filthy layers. He thrashed about, trying to climb out, but each time his hands gripped the edge, the soil gave way, dragging him back down. A body pampered all its life, never knowing hard labor, was now reduced to a pitiful, mud-smeared sight. I stood at the rim, watching with a strange mix of emotions. Part of me wanted to laugh. Part of me shuddered. Laughed because the one who set the trap had fallen into it himself. Shuddered because that man was my son, the same boy who once clung to my chest when thunder roared, now turned into someone willing to shove his parents into danger. Jonathan looked up, his eyes bloodshot, and shouted, "Mom, Dad, why are you just standing there, not pulling me up?" I pressed my lips together, my heart tightening. I wanted to reach out, but William shook his head. Calmly, he pulled a small phone from his pocket and lifted it, recording. The cold lens pointed at Jonathan, the man writhing in the very pit he had dug. "Dad, what are you filming?" Jonathan roared, fury twisting his voice. "I just fell. That's all." William gave no reply. He simply kept recording, his face hard and unyielding, like a silent judge before a guilty man. I looked at Jonathan, his brown hair now matted with wet dirt, his clothes soiled, his face contorted with rage. He clawed at the mud, spewing curses, each word so venomous it chilled me to the bone. "You think you can humiliate me like this? I'll never forgive you. This house will be mine sooner or later." His screams echoed across the quiet garden, mingling with the pungent scent of earth. And then, for the first time in 38 years, I saw something etched across his face I had never seen before. Shame. Not the shame of regret, but the shame of being unmasked when a schemer is exposed and made into a spectacle. In that moment, my heart clenched painfully. I realized the man in that pit was no longer my Jonathan, the tender boy of my memories. He was a stranger, filthy, bitter, and willing to crush family bonds for ownership and gain. I turned to William. He closed the phone, his gaze heavy yet resolute. No words were needed. I knew he had captured everything. Undeniable proof. I lift my head now, meeting your eyes, the one listening to this story, and whisper. For the first time, I saw shame carved into my son's face. After the pit in the garden incident, Jonathan could no longer hide his irritation. He sulked all day, yet his eyes still roamed like a predator unwilling to give up. I knew, once ambition has sunk its claws into someone's mind, failure only makes them more reckless. One afternoon, coming back from the market, I noticed the floor was unusually shiny. Each step felt as if it were sliding, the familiar grip gone. I crouched down, touched the tiles with my fingertip. Oil, a thin layer, evenly spread across the floor. A chill ran through me. One slip at our age would be enough to break bones, to confine us to bed. And then Jonathan would have the perfect excuse to prove. His parents could no longer care for themselves. My fingers tightened around the basket handle, my hand cold as ice. The boy I had once cradled and sung to sleep was now turning our home into a death trap. But this time, William was ready. He was a man of few words, but every action of his was measured. Days earlier, he had hidden a small camera on the bookshelf. Its lens pointed directly at the hallway right where I had discovered the oil. When we sat down to watch the footage, the images were clear. Jonathan, holding a bottle of machine oil, sneaking along as he poured a thin line down the tiles, then smoothing it with a cloth to leave a glossy, nearly invisible sheen. His face showed no hesitation, only cold calculation. My heart ached as though someone were cutting it with a knife. I clutched William's arm, but he simply placed his rough hand over mine and whispered, "Stay calm, Catherine. We'll turn this very plot into evidence." The next day, I put on rubber-soled shoes, the kind with a sure grip. I walked into the hallway, pretending to notice nothing. Jonathan stood at a distance, his eyes tense, tracking my every move. I deliberately let my heel slide a little, making a sound as if I were about to fall. Jonathan flinched, taking a step forward, but froze when he saw me standing steady, smiling faintly. "Be careful, Mom," he stammered, his voice trying to mask a flicker of worry. I nodded, hiding the tremor inside me. Never before had I felt so torn, acting out a part while facing the raw truth. That the son I had spent my youth spoiling was now waiting for the moment I would collapse. But instead of giving him what he wanted, we turned the feigned fall into a trap of our own. Because inside the hidden camera's hard drive, every move had been recorded clear, complete, undeniable. When William copied the footage from the hidden camera, I sat beside him, clutching the hem of my dress. On the screen, Jonathan appeared vividly, his hunched figure, the oil bottle tilted, slick drops spreading across the floor. No hesitation, no sign of remorse, only cold calculation. William quietly saved the file, locking it onto a hard drive. His voice was calm yet firm. "This is evidence. When the time comes, he'll see that his own actions destroyed his illusions." I nodded, tears slipping free despite myself. Not from fear, but from pain. A lifetime of being a mother. I never thought the day would come when I'd have to keep evidence against my own son. Jonathan seemed to sense something. After seeing me nearly fall yet walk away unharmed, suspicion flickered in his eyes. In the days that followed, he spent hours shut away in his room, his face dark. Phone pressed to his ear again and again, but each time I entered, he fell silent. One evening, passing by his door, I heard him mutter under his breath, "Why? Why didn't it work? Why does everything keep failing?" His voice no longer held confidence, no longer dripped with arrogance. It trembled, confused, like someone startled by his own reflection in the mirror. Unable to recognize himself, William watched his son, but said nothing. He understood silence now cut sharper than any reproach. As for me, I felt my heart crack once more. I stood before the bedroom mirror, the dim yellow light casting shadows on my tired face. In the glass, Jonathan's figure flickered past the hallway. Gaunt features, vacant eyes, lips pressed tight as though choking back rage. And in that very moment, I understood. The figure in the mirror was no longer my son. It was a stranger, a man consumed by greed and ambition until there was no room left for kinship or conscience. I turn to you now, looking straight into your eyes as you listen to my story, and whisper, in the mirror, I saw him, not my son, but a stranger. Victoria came to the house on a gloomy afternoon. In her hands was a laptop, and in her eyes burned a resolve I had never seen so clearly before. When we sat around the old wooden dining table, she opened it and placed it in front of Jonathan. "Today, we need to speak plainly," she said firmly. "I want you to watch this." The screen lit up. There was Jonathan, hunched over, tilting the bottle of oil onto the floor, wiping it smooth with a cloth, every movement plain as day. The room fell into silence, broken only by the pounding of my heart. Jonathan's face shifted for a fraction of a second, but only that. Then he gave a sharp laugh, leaning back in his chair. "And what's this supposed to be? Some edited video? Are my parents trying to frame me now?" I was struck speechless. William sat beside me, his eyes fixed unwaveringly on his son. Victoria, unfazed, replayed the footage. Stopping at the moment Jonathan twisted the cap off the bottle. "You can call it slander if you want, but this image is reality." The camera recorded every gesture, every expression. Jonathan sneered, his tone harsh. "I was just testing if the floor was slippery. My parents are old. I was worried, so I checked. That's all." I closed my eyes, pain stabbing through my chest. The excuse was clumsy, each word more tangled than the last, exposing the lie instead of concealing it. Victoria tilted her head, her voice sharp as a blade. "If you were worried, why pour oil and smooth it flat rather than clean it away to prevent an accident?" Jonathan faltered, at a loss for words. His eyes darted around the table, searching desperately for escape. At last, he muttered, Maybe I went a little too far, but my intentions were good. I looked at my son, my chest tightening. The way he twisted his words, contradicting his own actions, it was like staring at a stranger. The boy I once held against my chest, soothing through fevers, now sat before me, slickly denying the undeniable. The air in the kitchen grew unbearably heavy. William remained silent, his gaze locked on Jonathan as if to pierce straight through the mask. As for me, all I could hear was my own heartbeat, heavy, uneven, and the unspoken question that tore at my soul. How can a mother stand against her own son? As Jonathan stammered for excuses, my mind drifted back to a distant past. The memory rose sharp and vivid. Jonathan at 6 years old, sitting at the small wooden kitchen table, a pencil trembling in his tiny hand. I sat beside him, patiently guiding each stroke. That day, I chose a single word for him to practice. Honesty, son. This is the most important word I want you to remember for your whole life. I told him, my eyes alight with faith. Jonathan had smiled then, tilting his head as he wrote clumsy, crooked letters. I still keep that paper in a drawer, the word honesty bent and wobbly. But I once cherished it as a treasure. Now, staring at the grown man across from me, glibly denying the truth, my heart felt as though it had cracked in two. All those years of teaching, all those hopes, they seemed to dissolve into nothing. I lifted a hand to cover my face, tears spilling unchecked. Jonathan faltered, unease flashing in his eyes, before he muttered weakly, Mom, I didn't mean it. Don't cry, I just... William placed a steady hand on my shoulder, then raised his gaze to meet Jonathan's. He said nothing. His eyes were deep, sorrowful yet resolute, as if to declare that every excuse was worthless now. That silence weighed heavier than any scolding. Jonathan looked away, biting his lip, his fingers drumming nervously on the table. It was Victoria who finally spoke, her voice sharp and merciless, leaving no room for escape. Jonathan, if you're innocent, why did you erase the surveillance footage? The question sliced through the still air like a blade. Jonathan's eyes bulged, his mouth opened, but no words came, and I, lifting my tear-stained face, whispered in my heart, the child who once wrote the word honesty is gone. The air in the kitchen grew suffocating after Victoria's question. Jonathan stammered a few words, then suddenly shot to his feet, his chair clattering to the floor. His eyes blazed red, his face flushed with fury. You're all ganging up against me, he roared, his voice cracking like shattering glass. You never understood me. Since I was a child, it's always been blame, always suspicion. His screams struck the walls like a hammer, making me tremble. I stumbled back a few steps, my heart pounding wildly. He lunged forward, sweeping a vase off the table, porcelain shards scattering. Then he shoved a chair so hard it crashed against the floor with a thunderous crack. I clutched my chest, gasping for breath. The mother in me longed to rush forward, to seize those trembling hands like I once did when he cried as a boy. But the mother who had endured deceit and schemes held me in place. I could not yield again. Jonathan, I forced my voice to remain steady, though my whole body shook. We gave you everything, and this is how you treat your parents? He sneered, his tone bitter. Everything. All you ever cared about was clinging to this house. I deserve more than that. His words ripped my heart open. Decades of love, sacrifice, indulgence all reduced, in his eyes, to two words, this house. At that moment, William rose. He did not shout, did not slam his fists. He simply looked straight at Jonathan, his voice low and solid as steel. We raised nothing but a greedy man. The room fell silent, broken only by Jonathan's ragged breathing. I saw his shoulders stiffen, his gaze falter for an instant. But then, like a beast cornered, he roared again, louder, more feral. I stood in the storm of chaos, my heart both terrified and shattered. Yet for the first time, I did not collapse. I knew if I stepped back now, we would lose everything. Not only the house, but the last shred of dignity we still held. The crash of splintering furniture shook not only my body but seemed to rattle the very walls of our old wooden house. Jonathan's shouts, the thud of toppled chairs, my ragged breathing all fused into a storm of chaos. It wasn't long before shadows gathered outside. The front door swung open. Neighbors poured in, faces taut with alarm. They formed a circle in the living room, eyes fixed on Jonathan, panting, clutching a broken piece of wood in his hand. Good heavens, what's going on here? Mrs. Brown from across the street gasped. I heard the shouting all the way down the block. Another neighbor exclaimed. Jonathan whipped around, his gaze wild, his voice a snarl. What are you staring at? This is family business. But it was no longer just family. The whole street had heard, had seen, and no one could still believe the mask of the dutiful son Jonathan once wore. Then Florence entered. She leaned on her cane, each step slow yet firm, her eyes fixed on Jonathan with a look that was both pitying and cold. Jonathan, she said, her voice low but ringing clear, the whole neighborhood knows. Only your parents refused to see. Her words slashed through the last veil of illusion. I saw Jonathan falter, a flicker of panic flashing in his eyes. He glanced around, neighbors whispering, Florence standing as living witness. He knew his secret was no longer a secret. The air grew thick, as if one spark could ignite it into flames. Jonathan raised his hand, as though to protest, to shout once more and salvage a shred of pride. But before he could speak, a piercing sound tore through the night. WE oxygen monoxide. WEOO. The wail of sirens split the darkness, sharp and unrelenting. Blue and red lights flickered through the window, dancing across Jonathan's pale face. I froze, my heart hammering. William's hand tightened around mine, his gaze stern yet steady. The chaos in our home seemed cleaved apart by that siren heralding a new chapter, a harsher confrontation yet to come. A firm, commanding knock sounded at the door. When it opened, two police officers in blue uniforms stepped inside, the red and blue lights outside still flashing, casting long shadows against our walls. The chaos that had filled the house seemed to fall silent, leaving only the pounding of my heart. We received reports of violence and property damage in this home, one officer announced, calm but stern. I rose on trembling legs, William steadying me at my side. Jonathan stood frozen, his face pale, his hands still smeared with the splinters of wood he had just smashed. He opened his mouth to defend himself, but the officer raised a hand, silencing him. They separated us to take statements. I told them everything from the disguised contracts to the staged slippery floor. My voice quavered, but every word was clear. William spoke briefly, precisely, his gaze unwavering as the officer wrote. Florence added her own testimony, how she had seen Jonathan meeting real estate agents in secret, how often she had heard him raise his voice at us. Then Victoria opened her laptop, showing the officers the footage. On the screen, Jonathan appeared plainly, pouring oil onto the tiles, moving stealthily, wiping it smooth as if nothing had been done. The faint clink of the bottle against the floor echoed from the recording, every detail undeniable. One officer nodded, his tone firm. This is critical evidence. Jonathan stood rigid in the corner. As the glow of the laptop illuminated his face, I saw the twitch of every strained muscle. He tried to protest, his words stumbling. I was only testing. I never meant to hurt anyone. But the words were hollow. In the eyes of the police, the neighbors, and in my own, his actions had already condemned him. At last, the second officer drew out the handcuffs, his voice resolute. Jonathan Morgan, you are under temporary arrest for investigation on charges of fraud and endangerment. When the cold metal closed around his wrists, Jonathan froze. His face drained of color, his lips trembled, his eyes widened. It was as if all the blood had been drawn from him, leaving behind only a pale, lifeless mask. I stood watching, my heart tearing apart. Yet at the same time I saw the truth laid bare. Every lie must one day be paid for. As the cuffs locked shut, I could no longer contain myself. Tears welled up, hot and relentless, streaming down my cheeks. For months I had lived in fear, suspicion, torment, and now this moment struck like a blade, painful, yet liberating. I gasped for breath, clutching my chest with shaking hands, whispering words I could not hold back. At last, the truth has spoken. Jonathan was led out across the porch, his steps stumbling like a man hollowed out. Neighbors parted to either side, their eyes following him, some tinged with pity, others with caution. No one spoke. Only the wind whistled through the trees, and the clink of chains marked each step. William wrapped his arm around my shoulders, steadying me. He said nothing, but his silence was my strongest anchor. I leaned against his familiar, rough-hewn shoulder, finding a sliver of peace within the storm. We stepped onto the porch, watching the police car. The door slammed, the tinted glass hiding Jonathan's face. But before the vehicle rolled away, I caught a glimpse of his eyes, once innocent, once brimming with trust, now filled only with panic and bitterness. That image carved itself into me, shredding my heart. I remembered the first day I cradled him, his tiny hands clutching my finger. And now, those hands were bound by cold steel. As the patrol car disappeared, I still saw him, my son, behind iron bars. The sight etched itself deep, never to be erased. I turned to you now, my voice breaking in grief. I saw him through the bars, and I realized the boy I once held is now nothing but a criminal. The next day, news of Jonathan's arrest spread through the neighborhood like a summer wildfire. Neighbors who once met casually at the grocery store, the bus stop, or the corner cafe now whispered about the Morgan household. Some voices were sympathetic, their eyes sorrowful when they saw me pass by. Poor Catherine. She raised him all these years, and this is how it ends. But there were other whispers, colder, sharper. That's what happens when you spoil a child. They gave him everything, never disciplined him. Now they pay the price. Those murmurs seeped through fences and walls alike. They didn't have to say it to my face. I heard the judgment in their tone. It was as though all the blame had been laid squarely on my shoulders, the mother who had loved too much. I closed the door and sat silently in the living room. The afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the worn rug, while a single, tormenting question echoed in my mind. Have I failed as a mother? Memories surged like waves. Me holding Jonathan as a boy, swearing I would make up for everything he had lost. Me shielding him each time he erred, defending him against William, brushing aside every little mistake. Back then, I thought I was a good mother, a great mother. But now, the result was a son led away in handcuffs. I buried my head in my hands, tears dripping onto my wrinkled palms. The pain came not only from betrayal, but from guilt gnawing at my heart. William entered, finding me slumped there. He said nothing, only placed a cup of hot tea on the table. His gaze was steady, as if to tell me the blame was not mine alone. Yet I could not shake the feeling. Perhaps it all began with my blind, boundless love. That evening, as the sickly yellow glow of the street lamp filtered through the window, Florence arrived. She carried a basket of warm apple pies, setting it gently on the table as she had done for years. My eyes were still swollen from crying. She sat opposite me, studied me for a long while, then spoke softly. Catherine, stop blaming yourself. I gave a bitter laugh. And if not me, then who? Florence. I spoiled him. I made him believe the world revolved around him. If only I'd been stricter, maybe things would have turned out differently. Florence shook her head, her eyes warm with compassion. No, you were simply a mother who loved more than was necessary. There's no book to teach us how to be perfect mothers. We all walk in darkness, feeling our way step by step. I sat in silence, her words soaking into my heart like rain falling on parched earth. I wanted to believe her, yet the gnawing guilt still lingered. In that moment, a memory of Jonathan as a child came rushing back. He was running through the yard, eyes sparkling, brown hair tousled, his laughter as radiant as sunlight. I remembered the first day I taught him to ride a bicycle, how he fell, face first into the grass, then sprang up, grinning brightly. "Mom, I did it." That laughter had once been the most beautiful sound of my life, and yet now, when I recall it, the memory pierces me like a needle through the heart. I reached into the desk drawer to grab a tissue, but instead, an old photograph slipped out and fell to the floor. I bent to pick it up and my heart nearly stopped. It was a picture of our family on Jonathan's 10th birthday. Me, William, and Jonathan standing on the front porch. Jonathan was beaming, his arms wrapped tightly around our shoulders, his eyes shining with faith in a home he thought would never break. I sat frozen, the photo trembling in my hands. That smile, pure, sweet, now lived only in memory. I turned to you, the one listening to my story, and whisper. An old family photo slipped from the drawer, stirring a memory so bittersweet, one I know I will carry with me until my last breath. After Jonathan was taken away, the house sank into a strange silence. Each morning, when sunlight slipped through the windows, I still expected to hear footsteps, a door creaking open, the call of Mom, but there was only emptiness. The house, once a battlefield of lies and tears, was now so quiet that even the ticking clock sounded shrill. It was William who spoke first. "Catherine, we need to set things in order. We can't let the fragments of the past cover this house forever." So one morning, we began. I picked up the shards of broken porcelain, wiped the scratches from the wooden floor, straightened the picture frames knocked askew during the fights. William repaired the bookshelf, fixed the door hinges. Sweat dripped down his brow, soaking into his shirt, but his eyes looked brighter, lighter. And I too felt some weight lift as each trace of chaos disappeared. The pain remained, but at least the house was no longer a battlefield, it was a home again, a place where one could breathe in peace. We also refused to lock ourselves away within those four walls. William urged me to join him in community work at the church, preparing meals for the homeless, repairing benches in the park. At first, I did it only to fill the emptiness, but slowly, the grateful smiles, the kind eyes of strangers, warmed my heart. Each week, I also joined the senior women's circle in town. We sat in a circle, sipping tea, talking. On the first day, hesitantly, I told my story about the adopted son, about indulgence, about the lies that tore our home apart. I expected judgment. Instead, they listened, nodded, and one of them even took my hand and whispered. I went through the same thing in that moment. I understood I was not alone. By sharing my story, I not only freed myself, but also gave others a chance to recognize themselves within it. And through that shared empathy, together we found a measure of peace. After all that had happened, William and I slowly learned to lean on each other again, no longer pinning all hope on our son. It was hard to accept, but at last we understood. Some bonds cannot be mended, and peace does not always come from blood. Every morning now, I brew myself a cup of chamomile tea, sitting by the window to watch the sunlight stretch across the lawn. William tends to the roses in the garden, or tinkers with his old toolbox. We found joy in the small things we once overlooked when we gave everything to Jonathan. One day, William carried in an old wooden chair that had been broken for years. He set it in the middle of the room, took up a hammer and nails, and patiently mended each joint. I watched him, and the sight warmed my heart. It wasn't just a chair being repaired, it was a symbol of us, slowly piecing ourselves back together. I walked slowly into the kitchen and brewed a pot of tea. The fragrance drifted through the house, blending with the steady rhythm of William's hammer striking wood. It was such a simple scene, yet so beautiful. After all the storms, we still had each other, still had a home where we could sit, talk, or share silence side by side. For the first time in many years, I felt no gaping emptiness inside me, no fear of being abandoned, no desperate hunger to cling to my son's conditional love. I was learning to return to myself, to smile at the warmth of a hot cup of tea, or at a gentle song drifting from the old radio. And I want to say this to you, the one listening to my story. I have realized peace does not come from my child, but from within my own heart. There are nights when the house sinks into silence and I sit alone at the kitchen table, the yellow light spilling onto a blank sheet of paper. The pen trembles in my hand, but I know in my heart it's time to write down everything I've kept inside. I begin the letter with two familiar words, Jonathan E. Line after line flows out, like water rushing through a dam that's held back too long. I write about the joy of holding him in my arms for the first time, about the tears of happiness when he first called me mother. I write about the years of indulgence, the times I hid his mistakes just to keep a smile on his face. Then my pen shakes as I move on to the pain, the deceptions, the forged papers, the schemes to turn his parents into a burden. I don't hide anything. I write about the wounds that may never fully heal, but alongside the pain, I also write about love, the love that, even when betrayed, I cannot fully extinguish. I tell him, you have shattered your mother's heart, but you are still a part of it. I forgive you, not because you deserve it, but because I need to free myself. When I place the final period on the page, I burst into tears. My tears blur the ink. I fold the letter, slide it into an envelope, and write my son's name on it. But instead of sealing it, I slip it into the drawer. I know I will never send it. This is not a letter for Jonathan. This is a letter for me to set down the weight I've carried for so long. If William finds me there, his eyes gentle but knowing, he lays a hand on my shoulder, his voice low and warm. Catherine, forgiveness isn't for him. It's for us. I nod, feeling a little lighter. Perhaps forgiveness is not forgetting it, is simply refusing to let pain rule me anymore. The next day, I take the letter from the drawer. The envelope is intact, its edges stiff with dried tears. I hold it in my hands and step out to the back porch, where William has placed a small candle on the wooden table. I strike a match. The flame flares, casting a soft gold glow on my face. I open the envelope and pull out the letter. The crooked lines, blotched with tears, rise like scars from my heart. I gaze at it for a long time, then whisper, these are the words I've held too long. Now, let the wind carry them away. The flame caught the edge of the paper, trembling like a breath. In an instant, the sheet curled in on itself, burning away. The words dissolving into black ash before crumbling to dust. I watched the cinders rise, spiraling in the air, carried off by the gentle evening breeze. I did not feel empty. On the contrary, a strange sensation welled up inside me, as if, along with that smoke, the heavy weight I had borne for years was slowly lifting. Not all of it, but enough for me to breathe more freely. William stood behind me, his rough hand resting on my shoulder. We said nothing, only followed the drifting ashes until they disappeared. It had been so long since I last felt such a lightness in my heart. I sat down at the wooden table, my fingers brushing the faint traces of ash. In the flicker of candlelight, I realized forgiveness is not about giving someone else another chance. It is about giving myself peace. The candle burned low, its flame shrinking to a fragile glow. When it finally sputtered out, the porch sank into a soft darkness. I gazed into the open air, smiling faintly through my tears, and whispered, the candle has gone out, closing a chapter steeped in tears. Perhaps, if someone were to look from the outside, they would see my life as nothing more than a string of endless upheavals. But as I sit here, in the stillness of the afternoon, I see it instead as a book with 3 clear chapters: happiness, tragedy, and reconciliation. The first chapter was happiness. I remember those early years with William, this house filled with laughter. The day Jonathan stepped into our lives, I believed heaven had sent me a gift of compensation. I lived with all the love of a mother, innocent, hopeful, overflowing with devotion. Then came the chapter of tragedy. Love, given too much, and without discipline, turned into a blade that cut us in return. Jonathan grew up spoiled, never learning boundaries, never understanding the worth of truth. Each scheme, each lie was another knife into my heart, and the culmination was watching my son led away in handcuffs, a pain no mother should ever endure. But I knew the story could not end there. If it stopped only at tears, I would remain forever a prisoner of my own grief. So I learned to reconcile not with Jonathan, but with my own heart. I reconciled with regret, with the past, and with a shattered faith. I came to realize this. Love must walk hand in hand with discipline, and forgiveness must walk hand in hand with justice. Without one or the other, love becomes indulgence, forgiveness becomes weakness. That lesson cost me the twilight of my years, but I believe it is worth sharing now. Each afternoon, William and I sit together on the porch. He holds his newspaper, his gaze calm behind his glasses. I brew a pot of tea, set it between us. Sometimes we say nothing at all, just look toward the garden, where roses bloom in quiet splendor. In those moments, past and present blur together. I see Jonathan as a boy again, running across the yard with a bright, ringing laugh. I see my younger self, hair still black, eyes still shining, holding tight to a little family. And then I return to the present, to old souls side by side, resting in peace after the storm. I know that one day, this house will grow older still, perhaps belonging to someone else. But what matters most is not how many bricks or beams we keep, but that the lessons carved into our hearts remain. I turned to William, my voice soft but steady. We're not leaving behind property. We're leaving behind a lesson. He nodded, his warm eyes meeting mine, as if agreeing with every word. That lesson isn't just for Jonathan, it's for anyone willing to listen. Love must never be separated from discipline, and forgiveness only has meaning when it walks alongside justice. Suddenly, the sound of children's laughter rang out from beyond the fence. I lifted my head and saw the neighborhood kids chasing each other across the grass. Their pure, bright giggles like a melody of rebirth after long, gray days. Without thinking, I smiled. The world still holds so much beauty, still holds innocent laughter to soften the heart. I sipped my tea, drew in a long breath, and felt my soul being washed clean. Then I looked up, straight at you, the one who has been listening to my story. My voice trembled slightly, but each word was clear. If it were you, would you choose to go on indulging, or choose the truth, even when it hurts? My dear friends, if this story has touched your heart, I invite you to leave a comment and share your thoughts or your own experiences. And don't forget to subscribe, so we can continue to listen, to tell, and to live through stories together, stories that may be yours, or perhaps someone you once knew.